Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us here in Dorheuser for what I think will be a fascinating conversation about data and consumer privacy. My name is Garrett Graff. I'm the director of the Cyber Initiative here at the Aspen Institute, as well as a contributing editor of Wired, and so have been following and thinking about these topics for a number of years. And we have three really interesting sets of perspectives here today. Tom Wilson, the CEO of Allstate, Jen Buckner, who is, I'm at least going to make her wear two hats today, both as technology and risk official from MasterCard now, but I actually originally met Jen when she was Brigadier General Buckner at U.S. Cyber Command, where she headed the U.S. Cyber Command's Task Force Ares, which was the U.S. military's digital effort to go after ISIS, which was the first offensive cyber operation that the NSA at least has ever talked about publicly. And so sort of brings a really fascinating extra perspective about the value and danger of what data can do behind the scenes. And then we have Cam Carey, who has been thinking about these issues for a very long time, former general counsel and acting Secretary of Commerce at the Commerce Department, now at the Brookings Institution, where he's trying to encourage the federal government to do something about privacy. So today is June 29th, 2022, which, as some of you may know, makes today the actual 15th anniversary of the introduction of the iPhone. Which appeared 15 years ago today, and I think in many ways is responsible for launching the consumer data revolution that we have lived through in these last 15 years, as sort of our minute-to-minute activities have become trackable and usable in lots of ways that are both helpful and not helpful. 15 years ago as well, Tom Wilson, you took over as CEO at Allstate. And I wonder if you could start us off this morning thinking or telling us a little bit about how Allstate has watched data change the way that it does business as you get this very different perspective into the lives of your customers over these last 15 years.
My first thought was, I think I have a 13. And that's amazing that in 15 years I've now got the 13th model. So they obviously have done a good job getting us to buy new stuff. I would say that over that period of time, so the question is, how do we get here? Like, how do we get to where you have no privacy? And I think we got here by making the world better. And so it kind of started out for us too. You had this internet, you could connect people, you could get the data, you could do a little bit of search, you figured out how to make some money off that. Nobody really thought the data was worth anything, and it wasn't really worth anything at the time. They just wanted to do search, take whatever data you want, as long as I can figure out what else is going on in the world. And then that leads to more developments. That free data leads to speed the growth and the development of the technology and the uses of it. But data has no cost, so companies like us, we start accumulating this data. It doesn't cost anything, so all you got to do is get a server. Servers are cheap. You just accumulate more data. Nobody really thinks the data is worth that much. All of a sudden, it becomes more and more valuable, but the economy is moving along, and you got all these tangible benefits that you're getting every day, and nobody really wants to deal with the fact that you've got all this data. Then the criminals figure out, hey, that data is worth something. And it's all over the place, so they start figuring out how to steal it, and so they can make some money off it. And so we end up in a place where, as a business, we've gone from being an analog company 15 years ago that digitized itself to now building a digital insurance company. And it's different. Like, instead of delivering reports to somebody with information in it where they make a decision, the computer decides. And now the computer doesn't even decide, the algorithm decides, and then the algorithm decides when to change the algorithm. And so you get all kinds of issues around privacy of how are you using that data in a way that is driving your business forward, creating value, but nobody's really looked at the cost of it. So we're in, I think, it's a tough place to unwind, but we need to address the fact that we've outrun our supply lines.
Cam, this is a subject that you've thought a lot about for a long time. When you were with the Obama administration, you helped lead the development of the White House Consumer Data Privacy in a Networked World report, a framework for protecting privacy and promoting innovation in the global digital economy. On the off chance that there's one or two people in this room who didn't make it all the way to the end of the 62 pages of that report, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you viewed this challenge when you were in government, and sort of how, in your mind, this problem of consumer data privacy has evolved in the 7 or 8 years since that report.
Well, thanks, Garrett. And no, I think the driving force for us was about trust. I mean, that document that you talked about, the Consumer Privacy Bill of Rights, begins by saying that trust is a critical ingredient in a digital world. And we saw two sides of that. That in cyber, people need to be able to trust that their information is going to be safe from people who shouldn't have access to it. They also, on the privacy side, need to be able to trust that the companies that are collecting their information will use it in ways that respect their expectations, respect the context in which that information has been provided. And that notion of context, of respect, and fair information practices was central to the Consumer Privacy Bill of Rights. I think what we did not fully appreciate at the time, I think we were very focused on the internet and e-commerce. I think, I had worked in telecommunications, internet space, cable television, and representing clients as a lawyer before going to the administration. So I sort of came to the problem with some awareness of the extent to which the kinds of data that flow over networks, and the extent to which therefore companies can collect that data, and how much it can be used. I think we didn't fully appreciate the scope of it, and I think some of that really was the iPhone. We're all familiar, I think, or sort of, with Moore's Law, the doubling of computer processing power every 18 months or 2 years. But with the iPhone, and an increasing array of other mobile devices and sensors, you have those devices being multiplied, and then you have network effects. They are all interconnected, and on global networks that are moving at light speed. So that's another multiplier. Network effects works at exponential rates. Then add to that the increases in data storage. Servers are cheap, but now there's virtually unlimited data storage in the cloud to analyze all of that. And now you've got AI coming along, adding to the power to analyze all of that. So we've got multiplier upon multiplier upon multiplier for all of that data. And the fundamental problem we have, 10 years later, we still don't have a law is that companies themselves get to make the rules as to what they collect, what they use, who they share it with. And we have ecosystems of information sharing through app development, ad tech, data brokers that are unlimited. As Tom said, it's cheap to collect the data, and as long as you can collect on an unlimited basis and share on an unlimited basis, that's what people are going to do.
Mm-hmm. Jen, let me ask you sort of first to talk about this a little bit from your government experience side, which is you first came to the data world as a data exploiter. In the role of being part of Cyber Command, as it was really standing up and creating or sort of realizing the power of the data that was now available and how the U.S. could use that for strategic purposes. I wonder if you could talk to us a little bit about what that evolution was like inside the government, inside Cyber Command, as we sort of all woke up to the power and the potential of what this data revolution was going to look like.
I like that term, data revolution, and I would actually go back a little further to operations in Iraq and Afghanistan. Because it's, in the post 9/11 world, looking for that needle in the haystack, of course, some of the technical innovation fueled let's collect the haystack. And let's, from that data, let's tag it, let's store it, and we will then be able to do things with it. And that data actually drove the geolocation and precision targeting of dangerous insurgents, removing them from the battlefield. And as many battlefield commanders, to include General Petraeus, credits data as helping to turn the tide on the ground in combat operations. I think we're also an example, having been on the ground in 2008 in Iraq, that data then could also be used for good, because as that tide is turned and we began partnering with our Iraqi counterparts and turning to community rebuilding, establishing local governance, that same data actually fueled our help, our assistance to rebuilding an economy, to rebuilding local and governments, and reestablishing services. So that's an interesting, that happened in the span of 12 to 36 months. Let's fast forward to later as you talk about offensive cyber operations to counter nation-state adversaries or terrorists. I think some of our planning changed in our calculus around data. There were a lot of things we could do technically, but then the conversation turned to, should we do those things? And if we have to do those things, how can we do them in a manner that protects non-combatants, that doesn't have inadvertent or cascading effects on those not directly involved in conflict? And so you see some of those same, going from this technical framework to more of a human-centric framework for the use of data. I think that's consistent both across government and business over the past decade plus.
I want to stay with you for a minute, though, and now ask you about your current role on the outside of government and now inside a company where you are responsible for data protection rather than data exploitation. And I wonder if sort of how your perspective and your thinking about these issues has changed now that you are sitting outside of government, thinking about these questions that Cam has raised about, the trust that consumers have in the information that they are giving MasterCard.
Yeah, and I think we can't have a conversation about trust and data protection and privacy without addressing that underlying the security that enables all of that. And a security first mindset to be responsible and trustworthy and do the right things in the security landscape. Absolutely, first and foremost from a business perspective. But I think people might be somewhat surprised at how, unlike having been in uniform, unlike driving a tank or flying an armed helicopter, that being on the front lines of cybersecurity, whether you're in Allstate or MasterCard, or you're in uniform at US Cyber Command, it looks largely the same. And doing the right thing. I do think there's a great irony in that I spent many decades actually exploiting the weaknesses in human behaviors and compliance. So the fact that now I am on a front line of compliance, that is somewhat the ultimate irony.
Yeah. Tom, one of the things that I think is challenging for, and I'm going to ask Cam this same question after. One of the things that I think is very challenging about this world is that we, as consumers, are asked every day to make these little trade-offs in terms of data collection and privacy, where the immediate benefit is quite clear, and the sort of downstream assemblage of ways that this data could leak or be misused or held against us later is much less clear. It is, get your discount at Starbucks right now. Give this company your birthday for, a free donut on your birthday kind of thing. And that we lose track as consumers of sort of where that data goes and how it gets used down the road. How, and of course, in your world, this is in many ways sort of give us access to your car for monitoring purposes, and you will, in theory, if you are a good driver, get some discounts. So I wonder if you could sort of talk about how you look and think about those trade-offs and sort of how you make those trade-offs and benefits clear to your consumers and your customers.
So we also insure people's identities. So we have about 4 million people we do identity protection for them. And we've owned this company like 3.5 years. And what's been learning for me is we all want one click. Like, we really don't feel like doing all the work you need to do to protect yourself. So average person in America being tracked by 350 companies. We can tell you who they are, we can tell you what their confidentiality agreements are, how good they are, and we give it to people, and people are like, oh, that's interesting, and then nobody does anything about it. So we kind of want to do one click. So I think the struggle we have is we've gotten used to the computer doing all the work for us, and those benefits are quite immediate in front of you. We have to kind of sort that out. I think technology can help us sort that out. The place, though, I would start is transparency. So the average, if you were to read the average quote-unquote privacy statements that you check yes to every year, it would take you 73 hours. Nobody's spending 73 hours. So it's actually interesting. Only a third of the people say they check it without reading it. I just think that's not right. Like, I'm telling you, like, I never read these things. So, nobody wants to do the work. So I think in part because they're not really privacy statements, they're actually misnomered. They're really data sharing agreements. We should call them data sharing agreements. And I think there should be 4 standards across the country. Every company has to use the same one. Or if you use the same one, you can be subject to federal law. And the first would be that it's guest. You come on our website, you want to get a quote for auto insurance, you say you check guest, we don't put a cookie on your machine, we don't check your device ID, we don't do anything. You go away, you just went away. The next would be private, would be we agree that we can share the data to do work for you. Then it would be anonymous, so you could decide that you didn't mind it being bundled together with other people, and there'd be like healthcare apps and stuff that would be, and then it would be open, which is what you have today, which I can do whatever I want with it. I think if we could get consumers to just get some construct where they understood what they were giving up, and so when you checked guest, it's like, yeah, I don't really trust Allstate, or I don't trust Home Depot, or Action Auto Parts, or something like that, or no, I do, and I'm willing to do all the benefits that come with being anonymous. So I think we have to give consumers an easy, simple, standardized way to deal with this, because right now, all of our compatriots in the business world, they make it more complicated on purpose. And if you ever look at these cookie things now, when you try to do the cookie thing and then you hit the bottom and it says allow all cookies, you think you're checking, I want the ones here, and it erases everything else you did. So I think we have to find a way to make companies do it differently.
Yeah. Cam, what Tom is sort of talking about is the challenge that you have to be a super user in order to have any control over the way that your data exists. And one of the things that we've really seen over the last decade is Europe and the United States sort of split in their approaches to data privacy and consumer privacy online, with Europe moving towards the GDPR standards. But you have to think that when Europe created GDPR, they expected that to have some outcome other than, as Tom is saying, this new button that we all click when we go to any website now that just says accept all cookies. That doesn't seem exactly like the level of transparency and negotiation that Europe was probably aiming for with GDPR. How do we address this in a way that consumers can actually have any meaningful sense of how their data is getting used?
Yeah. Look, I think that the cookie menus that we get are ridiculous. And doing what I do, I spend a lot of time talking with privacy geeks. Nobody reads all of those policies. Nobody goes through all of those menus. And I think that transparency is important. We need companies to be honest about what they're doing, but we need more than that. I think people are clearly uneasy with the bargains that they're making. There's a lot of data out there that shows that people will click on those buttons, but they will also make choices about sites or companies or apps that they don't use because they don't trust it. And those numbers are significant. But it's fine to make those choices, to participate in a discount program, or I use the sports app Strava. Uploads all kinds of information about me and where I am, and stuff that can be used for health. But I know what I'm doing in making that choice, at least to an extent. But what we need is boundaries on how that information can be used, on what information is collected. So in those contexts, there are choices that people make. We need to leave some agency, but this should not be all dependent on what we read and what we consent to. We need normative boundaries that say you cannot collect data that goes beyond the service or the product that you are providing, except for a number of reasonable and expected purposes, like security, like servicing the transaction, like making actuarial decisions in the case of an insurance company. All of those are reasonable things. And to some extent, that is the model of GDPR. You've got to have a lawful basis for processing data. We need to leave some play in those joints for innovation, for the edge cases. And I think that's where GDPR falls down, and I think it's fallen down in becoming too much about those consents. That's how it's been viewed. It's all about consent. No, that's not what it's all about. It is about having a responsible data use framework that is a basis for trust.
Jen, one of the things that we've seen companies do sort of across the board over the last decade or two is adopt that let's just get the whole haystack of data. And there's been this fascinating story that we've watched play out over the last couple of weeks. Tim Hortons, the Canadian donut chain, it turns out that their app has been collecting location data on every Tim Hortons app customer. I think it's every 6 minutes that they have had in the app installed. I mean, this is basically the Canadian equivalent of the Starbucks app in terms of its ubiquity in Canada, and that they had installed that because from their perspective, they were interested in trying to figure out what of their customers were going to competitors and which competitors were they going to over the course of the day. Of course, for a nation-state intelligence service, you have now created this incredible data trove of location data that surely Tim Hortons was not thinking about creating a literally target-rich database for Chinese intelligence and Russian intelligence to suddenly look at and say, okay, which Tim Hortons customers' iPhones spend the day at the Canadian Ministry of Defense or the Canadian Security Services, and then on the weekends goes to casinos or strip clubs. There's sort of all sorts of incredible information you can mine if you know where someone has been every 6 minutes of their day. And I wonder from sort of your perspective inside a company and as someone who is sort of familiar with the way that intelligence services think of how to exploit data, how do you drive the conversation inside a company of sort of collecting really only the minimally necessary data? Because companies are so hungry to get everything that they can.
So we should call that the precision targeting for donuts.
Exactly, yes.
I think that to pick up on, perhaps this is a good place to pick up on the discussion that you, Tom, and MasterCard Board Chairman Merritt had yesterday on corporate responsibility and leadership in this space. And as we also would intersect the GDPR requirements, I mean, since 2018, the requirements, if today they show up as the cookie piece to an individual consumer, that they actually have driven some at least thought and in many cases demonstrable action in the space of considering responsible data practices, protections, and frameworks for decisioning on what they can do. That's why I provided that example of there are a lot of things we can do technically, but should we do them, and if we're going to do them, how should we do them? So having those data protection, those privacy and security principles as part of decisioning around product design, around technical solutions, I think is somewhat behind the scenes and a good practice. We see the rise of the chief data officer, which is perhaps a defensive move, but today positions us for this inflection point that Tom spoke about, and how can we build where we are today, how can we go forward with that? Because clearly the collection of real-time data for an individual consumer, there's a responsibility piece, there's a moral ethical component of that, that I think in a strong framework, in a responsible framework, that most corporations are moving away from that, and prioritizing individual protection.
Yeah.
But I would say it's hard too, because the business, as the technology changes, you move to quantum computing, edge computing, AI, you don't really know which information you will need. And you do want to have longitudinal data. And so while you can say, oh, I only need data to do this today, tomorrow you might need it to do something else. You don't know really where it's going. And I think the one thing that I've seen a lot of people do about fixing this is to try to control data sales and not let people sell data. I think what happens when you don't do data sales is Apple and Google dominate the world because they can use that data inside their company on anything they want. They don't have to sell it to anybody, but there may be somebody else who wants to compete with Google or with Apple, say, but needs to buy the data to actually compete with them, and they can't buy it from anybody. So you end up locking in those people that have that, let's just say, large market control position, and if by control. So I think it's messy. I'm not sure really how to do it, but because the ball's moving. It's like trying to catch the car when it's driving down the street. Like every time you catch it, it keeps moving.
And Cam, you've actually done some work on sort of looking ahead at privacy and data in the age of AI as it arrives, and these massive data sets and machine learning and so forth. And I wonder if you could, before I open it up to questions from the audience, give us some uplifting and hopeful statements about how this problem is only going to get much worse over the next couple of years.
Well, AI there's no question is going to magnify the problem. I mean, all of that data, the power and the granularity and the ability to aggregate information across vast amounts of data is just going to increase at an even faster rate. You now got machines writing code. That's accelerating the power of that information, and that's one more multiplier. The power of analytics to delve into all of that data. It's also going to, I think, add to the challenges of governance. One of the impacts of GDPR, and I think one of the salutary impacts of it, was that in order to do compliance, everybody had to get their data house in order. What data are we collecting? Where does it go? How do we manage it? And in this sort of freewheeling world of being able of unlimited collection, that wasn't taking place. But at the end of the day, that governance is an important part of corporate governance. Data is an asset. Increasingly, it needs to be managed, and corporate governance has been focused on finance, on risk management. These things are an important asset and an important element of risk that needs to be a part of corporate governance. But ultimately, this is going to take its direction from law and policy. That's going to define the compliance boundaries, the socio-technical rules that people have to deal with in order to manage all of that data. And we have the opportunity in the United States now to pass legislation. A subcommittee, a House subcommittee, last week reported out a bill that does a lot of these things. I mean, it's like any legislation. It's not perfect, but when it comes to setting boundaries, to dealing with sale, to limiting the ability of ad tech and data brokers to spread the data into the wild, it can have an impact. And we have a small window in this Congress to get that passed. We need Senator Maria Cantwell to work out an agreement with the other so-called three corners, the House Democratic chair and the Republican ranking members, to come to an agreement on a bipartisan legislation. It's going to take bipartisanship to get this done, but we do have a window of opportunity here.
Tom, when Cam is talking about data as an asset, one of the things that I thought was super fascinating when we were talking before the panel is the way that for Allstate, you now, as part of your car insurance program, have a window into how your insured drivers actually drive. That I think your number was you monitored 26 million vehicles every 30 seconds, I think was the number that you had. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how that has changed the way internally that you sort of think about your customers. How different are we as drivers from what we sort of tell our insurance company on paper to what we actually turn out to be when you're actually watching more closely?
Well, first, it enables us to give people a much more accurate price because we're guessing what your price is. Like most companies, you have a cost of goods sold, you know, a cost to make the shirt or whatever. Like we just don't know. You give us some money and we try to guess as to whether you're gonna have an accident and how severe it'll be. And so now with driving data, we can tell with greater specificity, and it is a much better way to do it. It's better even than we use some stuff out of your financial credit score. It's better than using stuff out of your financial credit score, and so it's good, and it gives people a better price. Everybody thinks they're a better driver than they are, and people are sometimes surprised. So the benefit, because I think, you know, the hope I would say is this has created a tremendous amount of value in America. All this, the whole internet, the data. I mean, the internet economy went from, I think in a 5-year period, the revenues increased by like $3.7 trillion or something like that, which is the size of Germany. And so it works, and that's a worldwide number, but it works. It's like we're creating a lot of value for people to do it, and and most people will first say, no, I don't want to do it. And then you say, well, you might save 10%. Yeah, okay. So people are willing to give up their information to get a better deal. We do it every day. I'm happy to do it, but I would like there to be some standards around it.
Yeah. Yeah. All right, let's open it up to questions here. We've got about 10 minutes remaining. We'll start over here. The furthest question away from the person with the mic.
Thanks to all of you, great panel. And yes, data is an asset. I'd say data is actually the new power. And I think we're at the emergence of what we're seeing as a data divide, where it's being really well used for commercial value and not being used to solve our social and environmental challenges. And so my question is, and I think a subset of that is around data ethics and AI ethics. And so I'd love to hear from the companies that how are you actually implementing it all the way through? Because my opinion and what I see is principles and frameworks are not enough because the complexity is down in the belly of the coders and data scientists. So I'm just curious of how you're building that into your companies since regulation's not here.
Jen, can I start with you and sort of thinking about how you are looking at all of the different ways that you can deploy the incredible data that MasterCard gathers on a daily basis?
Yeah, I'll talk about that from two different standpoints. The first is, I think, as you point out, principles and frameworks are really difficult to prove now, but yet the technology and consumer behavior is moving so fast that I think a lot of these regulations have to be principles-based. So I think I would call it a cyber training environment or range. But on the business side, we would begin to call it our labs, our analytic sandboxes. And I think the idea of a regulatory sandbox to prove, here's the principle, and here's how we can prove to our customers, to our regulators, and use it as an internal, tool to provide, are we doing what we're saying we're doing, is a really important development that I think we see proliferating. I would also counter that by, MasterCard Center for Inclusive Growth, you may have heard from Shmina Singh, which is actually the outgrowth of how can we use the data sets that we have in a non-personally identifiable way, but to do good. And that may be, standing up a separate entity to ensure that we're using anonymized data properly, and also data.org in a way that, partners with governments, NGOs, local communities and data scientists in a volunteer way. So, I think those are two sides of the same coin, but I hear you on the challenges associated with proving some of these things as they are developing.
Or just getting it into the business. It's just very different than other things.
Yeah, I think for us, I would say first it's early days because we're just kind of figuring out how AI and machine learning really works. But for us, it used to be you could do an algorithm, scientists would do it, you'd say, okay, how are we doing in the Detroit area? Like, are we discriminating against people who live in underinvested neighborhoods in Detroit? And somebody would look at it and you could decide and somebody would change the algorithm in it. Today, the algorithm does all that stuff. Nobody even knows what it does and it keeps changing it without everybody knowing because it's got some optimization thing. And so what we're trying to do is build algorithms that check algorithms. So which seems a little weird, but that's where we're headed.
A question down here. Hold on, just wait for the mic right behind you.
Hi. As consumers that we all are, what are your 5 tips? What should we be doing to protect ourselves? What do you do when you're on the internet buying things? What are the real life things we should be doing?
Cash, flip phones.
Do what the terrorists do. No, just kidding. Jen can tell us what to do.
Terrorists are people too. The number one thing is, is multi-factor. The idea that something so simple is a 90, 95, even 99% barrier to entry is so important. And I think that the proliferation of some incentivizing good behaviors, multi-factor is easy and it's effective. You don't even have to go to 5, just number 1.
So I'll
multi-factor identification is the idea that you have the move beyond just a password that you've probably repurposed for every account.
Yeah, and if you're not doing multi-factor, at least you need strong passwords. If you don't have a password manager, you need one. Use a virtual private network and use private browsing. I mean, those are some of the things that you can do to protect your security and protect your information from being shared widely.
Yeah, I'm not selling our product, but the thing I would say is get some product that monitors behavior for you. So when I do something like DocuSign for some investment or something, within seconds I get a notice that something's happened. So I would get somebody that does the monitoring for you. There's lots of services that do it.
Well, Allstate has a product.
We do. Yeah, I'd be happy to sell it.
It's not there, but there
$9.99 a month.
are others available.
It's really good.
But just to specify one of Cam's pieces of advice, one of the things he mentioned is private browsers. One I personally recommend is called Neeva, N-E-E-V-A, that you can download. Replaces your Firefox or your Safari or your, and it's specifically designed to block tracking and block cookies, and it gives you a running total every day of how many cookies and trackers it has blocked cross-site, and it is a stunning number. Even if you, like me, despite running a cybersecurity program and being purportedly quite concerned about personal privacy, I click accept all cookies on most of the websites that I end up on. Other questions over here? Mic coming.
We haven't talked at all about privacy in banking. And I think this is a big issue because today, with companies requesting auto pays and using ACH transfers of funds, I'm seeing a lot of fraud. People hacking into bank accounts. All they need is your routing number and your account number. And then all of a sudden you go into your online banking and you see your account has $3 in it. And you freak out. And you see along the line that people have been testing this bank account with little bits of change, debits and credits, and then all of a sudden they go for the big bucks. And the banks don't seem to have any privacy blockings in this. And they don't seem to notify you about any of this odd transactions going on. How can we protect ourselves if we want to do auto pays? A lot of these companies, that's the only way you can pay them. They don't want checks. They charge you for using a credit card. So what's the solution for that? How can we protect ourselves against these false auto pays?
Jen, thoughts on sort of financial fraud and cybercrime protections?
I think that what you talk about in terms of services provided through banks and anti-fraud capabilities has to be done today in milliseconds. I think we are increasingly providing small, local, regional banks the same capabilities that we would use, those same advanced capabilities for anti-fraud and identity protection, those same tools available to the smallest consumers, because we recognize how that undermines the entire confidence in our critical and financial infrastructure. I would also insist, if you are banking, that if your online bank does not include multi-factor authentication, that's one way you as a customer can, if I'm going to bank with you, I want these protections in place.
I do think one of the interesting things is that when you talk to security personnel at something like Bank of America, they sort of talk of their role as basically Bank of America is a fraud detection system that happens to handle banking services. That sort of so much of their sort of corporate focus is now in that sort of millisecond to millisecond fraud detection. Question over here. And I guess this will be the last question because at some point we ran out of time and I didn't
I'll be
notice.
quick. My name is Claire Bresnahan English. I'm CEO of a group called New Leaders Council, which serves Millennial and Gen Z leaders across the country. And I would be fascinated to hear how your companies are reaching this moment of where my generation feels very differently about privacy. We were even just talking about the angle of where we just have a totally different mindset and expectation of privacy. So how are you incentivizing behaviors when you particularly think about the digitally native generations that are coming up in your services?
Well, the consumer research supports some of what you said, but not everything. So the difference between those people who are, say, baby boomers who kind of completely cool with it being open, that might be 23% or something like that. In the generations you're talking about, it might be about 40, 45. So it's not 100% ubiquitous. So there definitely is a trend there because people grew up and that was the world, and because they see the benefits. So I think that the challenges are the same. That we all want to be protected. We all value what this has done for us. We value for what it can and will do for us. So we don't want to change that trajectory. But we need help, whether some of it's from the government, some of it's from companies, and I think technology can help do it for you. So that the app kind of knows, I don't want these people tracking me. Like that's what people really want. Nobody wants to go, you're being tracked by at least 350 people. Nobody wants to go through 350 people and try to unsubscribe. Like that, I don't even know how long that would take. So I think technology can get there.
Yeah, I think Tom is right that the data shows that the digital natives may be more willing to share, but also are more sophisticated about some of the choices and technologies that we've talked about. But just because you're willing to use a dating app, my daughter met her new husband via Tinder. That's how it goes on these days. But you do not expect that the information that you share, including sexual preference, is going to go out to data brokers when you do that. That has happened. Those are the kinds of privacy failures we need to remedy.
So we are the session standing between you and the lunch that is outside. So thank you to our panelists for a great conversation. And I'm sure something we will be talking about at future Aspen Ideas Festivals as well.